So now that we have covered the different types of CSS, that is the inline and the external CSS, the other important concept that comes with the CSS is the concept of the class attribute and the ID attribute. So I think in one of our earlier lectures we've already talked about the class element and the div tag. I think it was in week 1, but in this lecture we will briefly cover how do we style the div block that is defined by the class attribute, and how do we design the element within the div tag defined by the ID attribute. So I have included an example in here. So this is an HTML element with inline CSS, and over here I have the body element of this example HTML page, in which I have the div class that is defined div class with the class name of course, and over here and within this div tag I have the paragraph element, in which we have a sentence saying that this is an example of accessing the class element in CSS. So let's say that you want to style the paragraph element, and because this paragraph element is within the div tag, div tag, and the class name for this is course. So what we can do is to define the design or layout to define the design for this div tag. We are going to define the CSS rule that we are going to write is dot followed by the class name. In this case the class name is course, so we will write dot course curly brackets open, and then over here we the CSS rule that we want to write for this div block is that it needs to have a background color of black and padding 10 pixels. We can also add in the CSS rule that we want the text to be aligned towards the left, and so on. So there are like many other CSS rules that you can write for your HTML elements. An important point that needs to be mentioned or stressed is that any element or any div block that is denoted or that is defined by the class attribute, that needs to be accessed in the inline CSS using the period or the dot character. So that's about selecting the page elements with a class in CSS. Let's move on to our next topic, that is selecting the page elements with ID. I have there's a typo in here, with the ID in CSS. So let's move on. So let me try to explain this with an example. So over here, very similar to the example in this slide, in the 8th slide, I have the same HTML code, except that what I have done over here is that instead of the class attribute, I am denoting this block with an ID attribute, and I have chosen to call it course. So again, let's say that we want to style this div block in here. So because in this example this div block has an ID instead of a class, this element or this block in this page is going to be selected in our inline CSS page with a hash sign. If this were to be a class instead of div, then we are going to access this element with a dot sign. But because in this example we chose to call it ID equals to course, in our inline CSS we are going to access it with a hash sign. So with that, let me quickly recap the difference between an ID and a class in CSS. So an HTML element can only have one unique ID that belongs to that single element, while a class name in CSS block can be used by multiple elements. And the elements in a div are selected using the hash character, and the elements in a class are accessed by the dot character. So this is more or less about the CSS and the HTML layout. So in the next video, I'm going to give you a quick demo of how we can implement an HTML layout and how we can write write a CSS for the web page. So I'll see you in the next video.